that may aid a perpetrator in using technology to facilitate and abuse. However, as we have touched upon, technology is incredibly accessible and intertwined in our day-to-day activities, and it's a viable resource to all perpetrators of domestic abuse, not only hackers in dark rooms. Shockingly and upsettingly, quite often Track My Wife guidance will be on YouTube. I've even seen it on some forums on Facebook at points. It's if somebody is seeking malicious means to harm someone, it is accessible on a variety of platforms and isn't in the deep recesses of the internet. And as we move past these predefined ideas, we will begin to see around us and within support services, safeguarding spaces, and other organisations that this harm has been present for many, many years. And what we'll also witness is the rapid nature in which technology has changed and continues to change. Therefore, to understand what technology facilitated abuse is, we must also explore what it is going to be able to mediate this risk or harm when supporting service users. For example, it's important to consider how Internet of Things will affect victim survivors as the devices become more accessible within society. So Internet of Things, or IoT, is an umbrella term. It isn't one thing or one technology. As you can see in those wonderful pictures I have on my slide, they are a variety of technologies and applicable to many. It is different systems that have the feature of smart. So think smart TVs. Can you access, say, Netflix on your TV or the internet? Then it's a smart TV. Can you turn your washing machine on via an app? It's a smart washing machine. Do you pop your heating on via an app? That would be a smart thermostat system. And for those with disabilities, this can also apply to medical devices that they may interact with and can connect to the internet or send updates to their health providers, and other devices that may ease their day-to-day functioning. What we're finding is that those with additional needs are reliant on IoTs increasingly because it does support those with mobility needs or other additional needs, where the previous action of maybe using these devices, such as taking movement to turn the heater on or putting on the washing machine, is much harder. And so utilisation of IoT devices really help, but can also be used in terms of abuse by a perpetrator. It's also this idea that previously offline products or services are now given a network functionality, which means that they can talk to each other through the internet and exchange information and data that we are putting onto these devices. There is a bulk of research which looks at the risks deriving from Internet of Things devices and the uncertainties they bring with them. For those who create the devices, there is largely opportunities for each function. So these opportunities across functions can vary, and so we'll touch upon in this slide several of these. So for instance, voice control. This can be used by a perpetrator remotely to control things inside of the home. Audio recording allows the account holder to activate this feature, listen in to spaces where they may not have consent to do so. Video recording, a particular concern with smart TVs or with embedded video cameras, or even think Ring doorbells. Data collection, which makes it very difficult if someone wants to conceal from their perpetrators when they're home, how they use their devices, what they have been searching for. Shared accounts, in which a perpetrator can monitor actions by the victim or survivor. Location tracking, further monitoring by the perpetrator of the victim survivor. Think, for instance, the Apple AirTags that we spoke about earlier. The remote control aspect as well, which is a particular concern in terms of smart locks, in which upon a perpetrator leaving a perimeter or location, all doors that are closed can lock and will be locked per specified settings by the account holder, which at times and often is the perpetrator. Social media. Smart devices which link to social media, where a victim survivor can post updates, share activity, and this can provide perpetrators as well opportunities to reputationally damage victim survivors when posing as them, as well as lead to harassment, abuse online if they can't necessarily reach them. Machine learning. Now, there is little research on this particular emerging area of concern. We know that many victim survivors experience domestic abuse for many years and may leave and return in their journey. Machine learning is where the data and the information in which we provide is taken to the machines and is based on essentially algorithms to shape the way things are suggested to you or how the device adapts to you. But the data collected through the path can take a malicious means in which the information that a victim survivor may hope to keep private isn't actually private and can be accessed. I'm thinking, for instance, Alexas or Google Homes, where searches or even conversations in a room or ambient noise can be picked up by these devices, even if the victim survivor hasn't necessarily engaged with the device. And there has been evidence of transcripts of these conversations being uploaded onto the linked website. So the Amazon website, for instance, for Alexa, which means that for practitioners who may be having conversations with victim survivors in rooms where there are devices such as this, we don't necessarily know how confidential that conversation is, especially if the perpetrator is still linked to the account or is in the home. And this is where we return to the removal of the active participation by a perpetrator, in that these devices can be set on timers or work through account or device holder location without the perpetrator having to conduct any behaviours aside from maybe an initial setup and an occasional software update. But they are able to get lots and lots of data and enact many forms of harm. A big focus of the Gender and Tech group at University College London began with exploring the prevalence of Internet of Things in the home and the risks towards victim survivors of domestic abuse. On this slide, you can see a summary of a modern living room and the opportunities for technology facilitated abuse through just Internet of Things devices. So these are the concerns which we have talked about just now in the previous slide, shown in how it would present in a day-to-day living space. So what we can see is wearable devices. I've got one on my wrist at the moment, for instance. Mobile phone, I've got one on my desk. Laptops and tablets is how I'm speaking to you today. Remote control of heating. Don't know if everybody's as cold as I am today. Things like this, they're all part of our home and they are in our day-to-day life, and they become so part of the furniture that we may not consider them as potential risks or harms, but within a domestic abuse environment they absolutely can be, and so we need to be mindful of this. So now that we have thoroughly established what technology facilitated abuse is and how it may present, we will now discuss why we must, as practitioners and service providers, begin to understand this form of harm in more detail. Firstly, research on technology facilitated abuse has been found to that this harm is increasing at a staggering rate, particularly for those with disabilities in particular, and specifically those with disabilities who identify as women. Findings indicate that those with disabilities are at a higher risk of increased frequency, duration, and impact of technology facilitated abuse harms when they have additional needs. I'm mindful that this can indicate a lot of what I've said as technology is a concerning risk and we need to be very wary of it. However, it's also crucial to consider alongside the why, yes, the negatives, but also the positives of technological use and its interventions. For many victim survivors that seek support from yourselves or your teams, we do not want to only think of the risks. For many years, services encouraged the approach of throw away your phone. However, for many victim survivors, these devices or accounts are their only links to family, friends, remote working, and so on. Many do not have the financial means to change devices upon entering a safe house. And upon leaving a relationship, accessing devices may be a risk of harassment from a perpetrator, but might also enable the victim survivor to apply for jobs and re-establish their relationships. For those with additional needs, such as disabilities, we have seen that technology is a real lifeline to social circles, but as well as medical support and communication with carers and service providers. And the benefits can be phenomenal. I recall working with several survivors who had physical disabilities and needed support with their mobility, and they had found that because they had moved away from technology due to their experiences of technology facilitated abuse, they had become increasingly isolated and fearful to even go outside, and it had impacted their relationships with others. And as we worked together to understand this form of harm and how best to safely approach safeguarding and a safety plan, we were able to open up their relationships once again, connect them with others, and rebuild following an incredibly traumatic experience of domestic abuse. Let's consider research by Matthews et al., who looked at 3 phases of intimate partner violence affected by technology use, focusing on privacy and security. Firstly, physical control. In terms of risk, it doesn't mean necessarily physical abuse, but rather physically sharing an environment with a perpetrator, a living space, sharing devices, etc. Think, for instance, service users who may have disabilities, who may be living with their carer who is also their perpetrator of domestic abuse. The escape phase, the period that is the escalation and highest level of risk to victim survivors. At this point, research by Nicolaides in 2013 found that perpetrators of partner homicide began using technology to facilitate abuse as a final tool if they hadn't used it before. And so therefore, if you are spotting technology facilitated abuse, particularly during the escape phase, this may be an indicator to you as a practitioner that risk is escalating. And the life apart phase, or also a post-court phase, post-protection order phase, where essentially the victim survivors may also seek your support to not only explore use of their current technologies, but maybe more sophisticated technologies into their lives for the purposes of enhancing their security, such as maybe in sanctuary schemes by accessing ring doorbells and smart locks themselves for their own support. These phases at times vary in their speed and support accessibility for those with disabilities, in that it may be slower in the if a survivor of with disabilities, is struggling to link in with other practitioners during this time, if they're experiencing technology facilitated abuse and their perpetrator, say, is their carer and has essentially begun to monitor their access to services or their use of devices. However, if a service user is linked, say, to safeguarding or a practitioner service, and they're experiencing technology facilitated abuse, and we are able to understand this form of harm, we are able to even speed up the process of the escape phase, and which is the really crucially at risk stage, because we may already be linked in with the service provider if they're known, for instance, to have adult social services. Unfortunately, many devices do not have victim survivor security in mind. Designers will think about cool features and not necessarily safety implications. From an economic sense, the designers implement features that collect more data to make profiles look better and are not necessarily safe for those who are trying to conceal their information or flee an abusive relationship. For some victim survivors, this can look like terms of services not supporting their cause, such as security systems within the home being in the perpetrator's name, but they no longer reside in the house, but they will continue to pay the bills. And this gives them access to what's going on in the home. For many security services, they will not close the account, and thus the function of the device until the perpetrator closes the account themselves will continue. And they won't close the account, of course, because it's giving them information for what's in the home and for an ability to monitor the victim survivor. And as such, practitioners, myself included, have spent far too long in the past sifting through terms and conditions, which is the tiny text that we all tend to go, okay, and click agree to, finding a misuse of device clause so that we can argue to the product team to close the active accounts because the perpetrator isn't in the home, and so they're doing harm by keeping this system in place. However, in my experience during my work as a practitioner, it wasn't always successful, and it was a very large piece of work, especially if you consider service users with additional needs. Well, we need to be mindful of other safeguarding steps that we need to take. Looking through terms and conditions is maybe very low down on the priority level, but it's very tricky because monitoring with the home is such a significant risk as well. These challenges with product designers have led to technology-facilitated abuse researchers at University College London creating an intimate partner threat model. Threat modelling for domestic abuse and intimate partner violence when the threat actor is an intimate partner is far harder than an external threat actor because it requires a lot of understanding concealment and potentially using concealing methods for safety, which actually could endanger the victim even more. And for those with disabilities, there's a particular consistent concern around authorised positions that we need to be mindful of. For example, a perpetrator of abuse who may be the service user's carer, having access to all accounts, maybe their health appointments, and so there is a lack of privacy. And so it's very challenging to understand the risks available there and what is being seen and what is actually private for that service user. Research teams have also found that these abuses span to assistance technologies being used to abuse by perpetrators of harm, and this may vary quite substantially for what the particular needs of service users with disabilities may have at home to support them. Many technologies used to facilitate harm are often as well disguised. So a normal kettle, a thermostat, a social media profile, photos taken without the victim survivor's knowledge. A lot of devices also hold enhanced functionalities where the victim survivor may not know the extent of how much is being recorded or even collected about them. This can impact the day-to-day functioning of service users as well, with additional needs who may be reliant or supported by their perpetrator of abuse. And the research has found that perpetrators will often use the needs of the women that they support with disabilities against them to isolate and escalate the harm. And often it is the items within the home that are used to begin that technology facilitated abuse. We saw, for instance, in my previous experience, a large array of women with disabilities who, as the NHS app became used much more frequently, that these appointments that would be booked in for the victim survivor would be monitored by the perpetrator, who was considered the carer, who was also coming into every GP appointment, every consultancy, and through coercive control, they were able to cancel cancel appointments at a whim or withhold medications when they would go collect from the pharmacy for the victim survivor. There was a full span of control, and it started through and at the beginning with technology facilitated abuse, which gave them access to the understanding of the calendar, the appointments, what pharmacy, where to pick up, and so on. Which brings us to overestimation as well as underestimation of technology facilitated abuse. This is equally as harmful to one another. From University College London's work with the support sector services, many will wonder across practitioner services what certain devices can do, and we've also heard accounts of perpetrators stating that they have friends on the dark web and that they themselves are hackers, when in reality the information provided to these perpetrators are through, like what we touched upon before, functionalities across mobiles, information coerced from others on social media, and accessing victim survivor accounts that require much less sophistication than the fear-mongering that the perpetrator will seek to portray. Even, as I've mentioned before, Facebook forums or Reddit or YouTube, there will be information online often which, if someone wishes to do malicious acts, they can seek out that information. And very rarely is it that this person is incredibly highly technical. Sometimes they are, but more than not, they are typically a low level of sophistication and are finding out information through more accessible means. So, support sector and the overload. I myself have worked within the domestic abuse sector for a decade prior to my PhD position. I have had the privilege to work across a variety of settings during my time as an independent domestic violence advocate. If you are familiar with IDVA teams, we are here, there and everywhere: court settings, criminal justice, counselling services, economic services, housing, you name it. I was probably hanging around there at some point. As such, I'm aware that for many of us here today, we might not really feel comfortable calling ourselves techies, and many of my colleagues, and myself included, have felt behind as technologies have emerged in handling technology facilitated abuse. And it's normal to feel anxious about approaching this form of harm, and it comes from our place as service providers of wanting to feel capable in the support that we provide. Therefore, let's begin to answer our why question from earlier, is that practitioners must begin to understand technology facilitated abuse because it has been with us for many years and is only going to become more prevalent. Currently, there is a real lack of data on the presence of technology facilitated abuse across domestic abuse services and those that safeguard victim survivors of domestic abuse. There is even less so when it comes to victim survivors with additional needs and disabilities, and this includes as well across academic writings. Services don't generally explicitly collect information relating to this form of harm. It isn't explicit in the risk assessments necessarily we may carry out. So, for instance, the CARDA-DASH risk assessment, which is often completed by domestic abuse charities, it's alluded to, but it's not typically explicit. Of some services such as the police, there is the DARA that's being introduced, which is beginning to explicitly ask these questions, but we have a long way to go. And without a tick box and with a subjective view that many of our colleagues on this form of harm may have, the breadth of the risk posed to victim survivors is not fully known and can be incredibly broad. I've been in places previously where people have noted down, yep, technology facilitated abuse, and actually it's because the service user came in and they had a mobile phone on them. That doesn't mean necessarily that that form of harm is actually happening, but that shows that we may have skewing information, and so we need to begin to explicitly record what we are seeing and do it in much detail as possible so that we can have the most accurate understanding of what is happening on the ground and where we are when we're supporting service users. We do not doubt that the majority of cases across domestic abuse services and safeguarding services may have a form of technology facilitated abuse at some point. And when most of us have a phone, and Littau's 2019 findings indicate that mobile phones are the most used device to facilitate domestic abuse, it wouldn't be surprising. So even if we think purely in for the terms of text messaging and abusive messages, this form of harm can occur and can be accessible to perpetrators to enact the harm. It was reported in 2014 that 97% of Australian caseworkers, which is in Australia, it's a country that got started a little bit earlier than us on the technology facilitated abuse train, they found that perpetrators was using technology to stalk their victims across this many cases. And this is really, really substantial to consider and think about. In the UK, Refuge Charity, since the team that I was part of had the opportunity to set up the tech abuse team, began to explicitly record technology facilitated abuse. And in 2020, 72% of service users identified an experience of technology facilitated abuse. And this was really staggering to see as a domestic abuse charity, because we needed to consider our safety planning, our support planning, but also how the experience of technology facilitated abuse varied between the service providers that came to us in the UK and the agencies that we worked with when we noticed this risk ourselves, and how we communicated this to our colleagues. So for instance, in multi-agency risk assessment conferences, in child protection conferences, how could we discuss this appropriately and raise the flag that we need to be very mindful of when technology is involved, what is happening and what is the risk posed. This is important as it is showing that technology facilitated abuse, it's a growing threat. And in 2018, Women's Aid reported that 85% of respondents received online abuse from a partner or ex-partner. Now, since the pandemic happened, there has been a variety of research that has taken place since, particularly by Women's Aid, on technology facilitated abuse amongst their annual reports. And I really recommend reading those if you want to read up more on the experiences of domestic abuse during the pandemic. And what was found is that technology facilitated abuse escalated, but also what escalated was the misuse of medications and also the impact of perpetrators as carers during this period of time. And so we need to be mindful of those intersections of how technology may be used to enact harms on those with additional needs. So how can we begin to approach this risk of harm as service providers, practitioners, and those within safeguarding organisations? In regards to recording cases of technology facilitated abuse, we suggest establishing or encouraging the powers that be in your department to begin considering including the tick box of technology facilitated abuse. If it is there, we are more likely to record, and being mindful of what these definitions are. I am very aware, as I mentioned at the beginning of my discussion, that there isn't a preset definition, but even with the definition I provided today, we could take fantastic steps within our services on recognising this form of harm or risk and recording it when it may impact one of the service users that we may be supporting. Externally, it would be helpful if, say, the British Crime Survey included a category of this phenomenon. Generally, we need to all up our recording of this. For those in the police who will be seeing or introduced, as I mentioned before, the DARA risk assessment, which is currently being rolled out. I know in Kent it was trialled for some time and been rolled out, and maybe a bit slower for other services. It is all about recording. and putting as much detail as we can, particularly for technology facilitated abuse, simply because the ways in which this harm presents can vary so significantly between service user to service user in how it presents and what it has happened to enact this form of harm, and why the perpetrator is doing what they do in terms of the tech abuse. What are they doing it for? Is it reputational damage? Is it to enact control? And so we need to have this written so that we can keep the service users that we support as safe as possible throughout their journey with us. So I've mentioned again the DARA risk assessment. I would argue that the biggest challenge is in regards to the risk assessments that we may complete in safeguarding and support. The first thing that is typically done with a victim survivor when they access a safeguarding service is a risk assessment, particularly in domestic abuse services. So in domestic abuse services, the standard is the CARDA- or offshoot, such as the H- for honour-based violence and S- for stalking concerns. And technology facilitated abuse, as I've mentioned before, it's not explicitly discussed or noted upon. It relies on detail and efforts as practitioners being mindful of these risks so that this can also be communicated with your colleagues who may be learning this alongside you and who may later then review and support the service users. Being curious as a practitioner is really, really valuable with this form of harm. What technology is the service user maybe wearing? Are they wearing a Fitbit watch? Are they wearing an Apple Watch? What have they brought with them? Have they brought a laptop or their mobile phone? What have any of the children brought with them? Have they got an iPad with them? Has the perpetrator who during child contact has given the child the iPad, are they logged in? We have had instances before, and there was a case in America most recently in which a perpetrator monitored his wife through the child's iPad, through the listening capabilities that he had accessed on the device, and he had then planned around her contact with others in the home when he was going to enact homicide, and he unfortunately later did. And this was beginning at the point of technology facilitated abuse and what the child was bringing with them back and forth. Victim survivors, as we know, will often also not fully disclose their experiences. It's a very hard process for anyone to discuss their experiences of abuse, and therefore thinking and prompting a victim survivor to consider technology during this time can be the difference between their staying safely in a safe house, temporary accommodation, or within their home, or being found or at high risk. It's crucial as well to consider that they may not exactly even know what really is happening, particularly with technology facilitated abuse. Often it is described as my phone's just being really strange. If it say is, for instance, an application that has been downloaded onto the phone without their awareness, or they may have become the new normal for them, or the normal that has been established of, yeah, he just calls me like 50 times a day. It's really frustrating, but there we go. When actually, when a lens is put to that, we can see that no, that's very unusual, that's not healthy, that's not safe, and we need to address that. In terms of safety planning, which is often the second stage of engagement upon risk assessment completion, the safety plan is often applicable, of course, whether the victim survivor is still residing or with the perpetrator, or they have left. I again encourage curiosity, much like the risk assessment. It's easy to consider a mobile phone, a laptop, these often overtly visible devices when we support a victim survivor, but being curious of all technologies, particularly those with disabilities. What medical devices do they have in their home that they may be utilising? What devices do they use for their day-to-day functioning that actually may be manipulated by a perpetrator to isolate them further or enact harm? I encourage that also for the victim survivor to be curious of what is in their home and being mindful of what may be utilised by the perpetrator. Encourage their consideration of their home and that they may still reside in, the items that they might want to take to a safe house, or what can be traced and what can be secured and how. And when safe to do so, maybe taking those security and privacy steps prior to moving to another residence or accommodation if time allows for it. We must also remember we have the internet at our fingertips as service users, service providers and practitioners. Device creators such as Apple or Samsung, etc., often have privacy and security guides online. These are all fantastic resources, but we need to be very mindful when we do give these resources to victim survivors. Evidence on a device which a service user may keep on their phone and may be part of a police investigation or a court process can be wiped when securing a device. There may also be an escalation in the risk when securing a device. For instance, if the perpetrator has placed themselves as a emergency link, say for instance you change your email details and you have a backup email and the perpetrator has placed that as their own. And if the victim survivor tries to change or secure their email, the perpetrator will be notified of these changes, which can escalate their risk of harm as well. And so being very mindful that when we do give guidance, we have done an appropriate safety plan on if there is an escalation or if a risk occurs, what will be our response. I understand, of course, there is very little time in your days as it is, but encouraging this learning process as well for victim survivors is crucial for their independence and learning where possible. Consider the support around them also. When adult social services are involved, fantastic. What is the plan? Who are the other agencies that are working alongside that? Are there safe family members and friends? Could a safe house support this individual? Could there be a monthly meeting tech safety tip session? What can we do to increase survivor education on this matter as well, so that they feel more prepared, so that when they may leave our services in the future, they feel more confident in protecting themselves and keeping themselves safe. I would also encourage awareness of how technologies are used by victim survivors to ensure their safety. Are they taking photos, for instance, within their safe houses or their new residence? Where are those photos being uploaded? Is the perpetrator that they have fled from also friends with them and so can see the images on their account or social media services? Or is their social media completely open to everybody, and so the perpetrator doesn't even need to be friends with them? They can monitor from a distance online and can see this information anyway. Are they giving tips as to where they are, where they're going, who they're with, or things like this? If they send this information to a perpetrator as well, if we consider child custody agreements, sometimes there will be an agreement that there will need to be photos sent to the other parent. And so when we send photos, we need to be mindful, because if location services are on at that time, the location may be recorded, the time and date is stamped on the photo, and so these may be sent to an alleged perpetrator, and all they need to do is look at the details on the photo, and they have information that the victim survivor and yourselves as practitioners have been working very hard to keep concealed. So we need to be very mindful of the gaps that we may not necessarily consider, and be very cautious in the steps that we take. For those in the virtual room who work with or have supported perpetrator programs in the past, what I am mindful of is that frequently as well, there is not much inclusion of technology facilitated abuse specifically or explicitly currently in many of these prevention programs. This is a blind spot with regard to how this could be properly accounted for in these training sessions. However, work with the European Network for Work with Perpetrators, they have begun to explore the risks posed more and more, and we really encourage this exploration and work because services working with perpetrators, whether that be dedicated perpetrator programs or probation services or other safeguarding entities that have worked with the perpetrators, being mindful of how technology facilitated abuse can be used to harm is very, very important to be clear and mindful of. So, for instance, is the perpetrator an account holder? Did they buy the devices that the victim survivor now uses? What may this mean? If they're an account holder, for instance, this may mean that they can impact the use of the device itself. They can impact the payments made and much more. Did they buy the devices? Have they had physical access to the devices? Well, this may mean that they have potentially downloaded services or apps onto the device itself, which may have recording capabilities. Although, as we've mentioned before, this is quite sophisticated, and so the lower tech methods of what else may they have done to the device and being mindful of the risks this may pose. Many of the implementations or the suggestions I've given you will require a lot of independent effort and encouragement within your organisations, but technology facilitated abuse, despite awareness growing in the UK, it's still very much focused upon within leading countries such as America and Australia, where they have dedicated research hubs and also increased awareness. Now, these countries have done fantastic things in being very mindful that service organisations and safeguarding services have very limited time and that your days are very, very busy. And so they have sought to come up with different interventions or support services that might be able to take that load off a little bit, because I've given a lot of information around what to look out for, and on top of your day-to-day role, this can seem quite daunting. And so these are the approaches that these countries have taken in supporting practitioners. One of the core ways that practitioners and organisations can support the work of recognising and responding to technology facilitated abuse is what they've done through policy work. Currently, much legislation is separate, so cybercrime, domestic abuse and stalking and harassment, they're all affected by technology facilitated abuse. And in the UK, as we begin to recognise technology facilitated abuse more, we have begun to implement the Domestic Abuse Act and a progression towards the Online Harms Bill. However, as seen from the focus upon coercive and controlling behaviour, in the Domestic Abuse Act, instances of technology facilitated abuse are often they're swallowed by wider definitions and then lose the ability to effectively and distinctly acknowledge this harm in the UK. Whereas centralisation is the method taken by Australia to recognise and respond to technology facilitated abuse. There is a dedicated e-safety commissioner, which is a public body that gives advice for those vulnerable to technology facilitated harms, not just domestic abuse victim survivors. And the e-safety commissioner seeks to empower people to be safe online, and they hold a dedicated reporting platform when these harms occur. In the UK, our equivalent at present could be considered the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, but that is not specialised to the need of technology facilitated abuse. The voluntary sector is also quite dispersed, as we've touched upon frontline workers and often disciplines that are not technology focused, so criminal justice or social work, etc. But in Australia, this query is considered through provisions such as helplines, accessible to those with safeguarding responsibilities, where a dialogue can be provided with the practitioner and the victim, alongside a technology expert who can talk from a cybersecurity perspective to the practitioner and victim on what are the risks that they would consider, and then how the practitioner may proceed and integrate this within their safety plan. A development that has been explored as well is the idea by the Cornell Tech team in America, where they are currently offering technology abuse clinics. So these are a little bit like your one-stop shops that you may have come across before, where they sit within a research hub working with domestic abuse services in New York, and victim survivors are flagged as high risk of technology facilitated abuse, are then signposted to the clinic from the domestic abuse service itself. There they receive specialised cybersecurity support such as phone scanning, malicious software review, privacy increases, and so on, in alignment with the risk assessment and through the support of technologists aligning with the safety plan, as well as any police investigations that may be going on, to make sure that any evidence that they may come across is preserved safely, but also that the survivor can be supported towards safety. We can hope for something similar in the UK. Currently, our closest route is the Cyber Helpline, which is a charity that assists those who have been victims of cybercrime and review their devices safely, record evidence, and report their experience of crime. Here is the Cornell Tech website should you want to explore this, as well as the Cyber Helpline. I currently have recently taken on a position as a cyber stalking specialist at the Cyber Helpline alongside my PhD, and a lot of the support that we provide is around harassment online, particularly for those who have experienced intimate partner violence within the cyber stalking team. And what we provide is we take the time to go through the devices that are affected, what apps may be affected, and we support the practitioner and any police investigations through the preservation of evidence, as well as working with the survivor themselves to talk about what devices and accounts may be affected and the steps towards safety alongside the safety plan that a safeguarding practitioner or service may have already implemented. This is very much a multi-agency approach that takes place. And so it's very, very active, and it isn't necessarily an immediate support that can be provided, as it's quite a small charity at the moment, but it's continually growing. And I feel really privileged to have been part of the service as it grows. So we've talked about how practitioners can respond going forward, but what about industry? For many victim survivors, feedback has ranged from make settings easier to understand, notify me of if my device links to anything that I haven't, seen or been aware of before, or alert of on-screen movable icons when connected to other devices in our interactions with industry teams, whether supporting a victim survivor to report to a social media platform or contact a home security brand. Encouraging awareness of the vulnerability and risks posed when these victim survivors are not considered in the terms and conditions or development process. It's crucial to enact change. Okay. This talk has provided a very broad overview of what, why, and how. Going forward, it is incredibly important that quantifying the presence and frequency of technology facilitated abuse in the victim survivor experience is achieved across teams and organisations. To do so, we must ensure risk assessments and safety plans thoroughly explore the dynamic nature of this harm. We must advocate for policy alignment so that this risk is appropriately recognised in government and that our commissioners of our services are aware of the harms posed to victim survivors as the world becomes increasingly reliant in the digital space. And finally, we need to support one another. Curiosity through encouraging exploration of technology facilitated abuse to colleagues will encourage critical change in the safety and support of victim survivors' experiences or risk of this abuse. There are services, as I've mentioned in the UK, like the Cyber Helpline or even Refuge's tech team, where if the service user is currently under a refuge service, they can access the tech team there who do similar work to the Cyber Helpline. These are all services that are beginning to enact change to support you as service providers and practitioners to help with the load that this emerging form of harm takes. If you are interested in learning more about the research discussed today, please feel free to check out our website at University College London, as we're always happy to answer any questions or queries. As was mentioned at the beginning of the talk, any questions in the chat can be responded to by myself when forwarded, so that I can hopefully support you in your journey as service providers and practitioners. And here's the website as well that you can visit. So simply use your search engine of choice and type in gender and tech at University College London to find us. We have a really fantastic newsletter. It's a bit of a chunky newsletter, I will warn you now, but there are parts where it's news articles, videos that are relevant to this form of harm, as well as academic articles if you particularly enjoy this, as well additionally for events that take place, whether they be at the university or spanning the country or Zoom and are across the world. Here is my information, should you wish to pick my brain on Twitter at any point, or at least follow along with the research that's taking place. My specific research on technology-facilitated abuse is exploring the risk and harm, and I'm currently exploring domestic homicide reviews and where technology-facilitated abuse has occurred. As we've discussed before, there has been instances where risk and harm has begun with the signs being in technology-facilitated abuses, and so I want to explore that further and see what that means for risk for this harm.
Obviously not very tech enabled, so thank you so much for that. That was really, really valuable, and hope the agencies and practitioners on today are able to take something back to your agencies. I think I've definitely learned a lot about tech, as we know mine may not be that great with the unable to mute, but thank you again from both the board and the community safety team.